The White House briefing room was buzzing with unprecedented energy as Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt prepared for what would become one of the most explosive international press conferences in recent memory. At just 26 years old, she had become the youngest White House press secretary in history, and her combative style had already made her a rising star in Trump's administration. President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso was in Washington for a rare bilateral meeting, and his presence had attracted intense media attention. The 34-year-old African leader's policies of nationalizing resources, expelling Western military bases, and challenging international financial institutions had made him a controversial figure in American foreign policy circles. "Ladies and gentlemen," Leavitt began, her voice carrying the confident authority that had made her famous, "I want to address some concerning developments in Burkina Faso under the current military leadership. President Trump believes strongly in democratic governance and the rule of law, and we have serious concerns about the direction of Burkina Faso under its current leadership." The opening was deliberately provocative, setting up what was clearly intended to be a public confrontation with Traore, who sat calmly in the front row of the press gallery, having been invited to observe the briefing. The Trump administration supports legitimate governments that respect democratic institutions, protect human rights, and maintain positive relationships with international partners. Military coups, regardless of their stated intentions, undermine the foundations of democratic governance and create instability that threatens regional security. Leavitt's tone was lecturing, almost professorial, as if she were delivering a civics lesson to someone who didn't understand basic principles of governance. "President Traore," she said, turning to address him directly in an unprecedented breach of diplomatic protocol, "your policies of nationalizing foreign investments, expelling international peacekeeping forces, and rejecting established international agreements raise serious questions about your commitment to the rule of law and respect for international norms." The direct address was stunning. Press secretaries traditionally avoided confronting foreign leaders in public forums, but Leavitt was clearly intent on making a statement about American disapproval of Traore's policies. Traore remained perfectly still, his expression giving no indication of his thoughts as the young American official continued her public criticism. "The United States believes in sovereignty, but sovereignty must be exercised responsibly. When leaders prioritize populist rhetoric over practical governance, when they reject international cooperation in favor of isolation, they ultimately harm their own people and destabilize their regions." The condescension was unmistakable, and several journalists in the room exchanged glances, recognizing that they were witnessing something highly unusual. "We encourage all leaders, especially young leaders, to learn from established democracies about the importance of institutional restraint, respect for opposition voices, and cooperation with international partners who can provide expertise and resources for development." The phrase, "young leaders," was clearly directed at Traore, and the implication that he needed to learn from American leadership was obvious to everyone present. "President Traore, would you like to respond to these concerns?" Leavitt asked, offering him a microphone with what appeared to be genuine confidence that she had successfully put him on the defensive. Traore stood slowly, accepting the microphone with a slight nod of acknowledgement. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and carried none of the defensiveness that Leavitt had apparently expected. "Thank you, Ms. Leavitt. I appreciate the opportunity to address your concerns, and I'm grateful for this chance to engage in dialogue about governance, sovereignty, and international cooperation." His polite tone immediately shifted the dynamic, making Leavitt's aggressive approach seem unnecessarily confrontational by comparison. "You mentioned that the Trump administration supports legitimate governments that respect democratic institutions. I'm curious about how you define legitimacy in this context." The question was simple but loaded, and several journalists leaned forward, sensing that Traore was about to challenge Leavitt's framework rather than simply responding defensively to her criticism. Is legitimacy determined by the process through which leaders come to power, or by the outcomes they deliver for their people? Because I think this distinction is crucial for understanding the situation in Burkina Faso. Leavitt looked slightly uncomfortable, clearly not having expected to be questioned in return. Legitimacy requires both democratic processes and good governance outcomes, she replied, trying to maintain her authoritative stance. Interesting, Traore said, his tone remaining conversational. Because the government I overthrew was indeed elected through democratic processes. It had been in power for decades, had changed the constitution to eliminate term limits, and had rigged multiple elections to maintain control. He paused, allowing this information to register with the audience. But more importantly, that democratically legitimate government had presided over a system where foreign companies extracted billions of dollars worth of gold from Burkinabe soil while ordinary citizens remained among the poorest people in the world. The specific details were clearly making Leavitt uncomfortable, as they complicated her simple narrative about legitimate versus illegitimate governance. It was a government that allowed French military bases to operate on our territory not to protect Burkinabe citizens, but to protect French corporate interests. It was a government that borrowed hundreds of millions from international lenders for projects that primarily benefited foreign contractors. Traore's tone remained calm, but his words were systematically dismantling the assumptions underlying Leavitt's criticism. So I would ask you, Ms. Leavitt, was that government legitimate because it followed democratic procedures, or was it illegitimate because it failed to serve its people's interests? The question was perfectly crafted to expose the contradictions in American foreign policy, which often supported legitimate governments that served American interests while opposing illegitimate governments that prioritized their own people's welfare. Leavitt was clearly struggling now, her confidence shaken by Traore's calm, logical response. President Traore, you can't just dismiss democratic institutions because you disagree with their policies. The rule of law requires a mess. Leavitt, Traore interrupted gently, let me ask you about the rule of law. Which laws are you referring to? Burkinabe laws that prioritized foreign corporate profits over domestic development? International laws that legitimized colonial-era extraction agreements? Or perhaps American laws that I should somehow follow despite being the president of a sovereign African nation? The questions were coming rapidly now, each one more pointed than the last, and Leavitt was visibly losing control of what she had intended to be a one-sided criticism session. You mentioned that sovereignty must be exercised responsibly, Traore continued. Could you help me understand what responsible sovereignty looks like? Because from my perspective, responsible sovereignty means ensuring that my country's resources serve my people's development rather than foreign shareholders' profits. It means making sure that military forces operating on our territory serve our security interests rather than foreign strategic objectives. It means borrowing money for projects that benefit our citizens rather than enriching international contractors. Each point was a direct challenge to the international system that Leavitt was defending, presented with a logical clarity that made her position seem increasingly untenable. If that's irresponsible sovereignty, then I'm curious about what responsible sovereignty would require me to do. Should I continue allowing foreign companies to extract our gold while my people lack healthcare? Should I maintain foreign military bases that protect foreign interests while Burkinabe citizens face security threats? The rhetorical trap was perfect, forcing Leavitt to either defend a system that obviously harmed African people or abandon her criticism of Traore's policies. President Traore, Leavitt said, her voice carrying a new edge of frustration, you're creating false choices. International cooperation doesn't require accepting exploitation. There are ways to work with international partners that benefit everyone involved. Are there? Traore asked, his eyebrows rising slightly. Ms. Leavitt, could you give me some specific examples of international cooperation that has benefited African countries as much as it has benefited their international partners? The challenge was direct and specific, putting Leavitt in the position of having to defend decades of international development policies that had consistently failed to reduce African poverty despite generating enormous profits for Western corporations and institutions. Leavitt paused, clearly struggling to formulate a response that wouldn't sound like she was defending exploitation. President Traore, there are many successful examples of international partnership. The United States has provided billions in development aid to African countries, supported education and healthcare programs, and facilitated trade relationships that have created jobs and economic growth. Billions in aid, Traore repeated, his tone becoming slightly more pointed. Ms. Leavitt, how much has the United States provided in aid to African countries over the past decade? I don't have exact figures, but it's been substantial, Leavitt began. Approximately $8 billion annually, Traore supplied. And how much do American corporations extract from African economies annually in terms of resource revenues, repatriated profits, and debt service payments? Leavitt looked uncomfortable, clearly not having expected to be challenged with specific economic data. I don't have those numbers readily available. Approximately $80 billion annually, Traore continued. So for every dollar the United States gives Africa in aid, American corporations extract $10 from African economies. Would you call that beneficial international cooperation? The 10-to-1 ratio was devastating, reducing American aid programs to a statistical rounding error compared to the wealth flowing in the opposite direction. That's an oversimplification, Leavitt protested. Is it? Ms. Leavitt, let me ask you about a specific example. American mining companies operating in African countries typically pay local governments between 2% and 5% royalties on extracted resources. Those same companies then sell those resources on international markets at prices that generate profit margins of 300 to 500%. Meanwhile, the communities where extraction occurs often lack access to clean water, healthcare, or education despite living above some of the world's most valuable mineral deposits. Would you call that successful international cooperation? The specific examples were making it impossible for Leavitt to dismiss Traore's arguments as mere rhetoric or anti-Western sentiment. President Traore, you're cherry-picking statistics to support your narrative, Leavitt said, trying to regain control of the conversation. American companies also provide jobs, technology transfer, and infrastructure development that benefit local communities. Do they? Traore asked. Ms. Leavitt, what percentage of workers in American-owned African mines are paid wages that would be considered acceptable in the United States? Another specific challenge that Leavitt clearly couldn't answer with confidence. American mining companies in Africa typically pay local workers between $2 and $5 per day for labor that generates hundreds of dollars per day in value. American safety standards, environmental protections, and worker rights that are mandatory in the United States are routinely ignored in African operations. Is that what you mean by technology transfer and community benefit? The systematic dismantling of American corporate practices in Africa was clearly making Leavitt increasingly uncomfortable, but Traore wasn't finished. You mentioned that the Trump administration encourages young leaders to learn from established democracies about institutional restraint and international cooperation. I'm curious about WH. The silence in the White House briefing room was deafening as Karoline Leavitt struggled to formulate a response to Traore's devastating question about following American rhetoric versus American behavior. The 26-year-old press secretary, who had built her reputation on aggressive confrontations with hostile media, now found herself completely outmatched by an African leader who had turned her own talking points into weapons against her. President Traore, Leavitt said, her voice lacking its earlier confidence, I think you're mischaracterizing American foreign policy and creating false equivalencies between legitimate security concerns and the kind of destabilizing actions we've seen in Burkina Faso. It was a weak deflection, and everyone in the room could sense her desperation to regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her expectations. Mischaracterizing? Traore asked, his tone remaining perfectly calm. Ms. Leavitt, let me be more specific about American foreign policy so there's no mischaracterization. He paused, scanning the room full of journalists who were now frantically taking notes, understanding they were witnessing something unprecedented. In 2011, the United States led a military intervention in Libya that overthrew the government of Muammar Gaddafi. Libya went from being Africa's most prosperous country to a failed state with open slave markets. Was that responsible sovereignty? The specific example was devastating because it highlighted a clear case where American intervention had created exactly the kind of instability that Leavitt claimed to oppose. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq based on false claims about weapons of mass destruction. The invasion led to hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths, the rise of ISIS, and regional destabilization that continues today. Was that respect for international law? Each example was chosen for maximum impact, highlighting American policies that had produced outcomes far worse than anything Traore had implemented in Burkina Faso. Ms. Leavitt, you criticized me for expelling foreign military bases from my country. But American military bases operate in over 80 countries around the world, often without the genuine consent of local populations. How is American military presence in 80 countries different from the French military presence I expelled from Burkina Faso? The parallel was perfect because it exposed the hypocrisy of criticizing African leaders for rejecting foreign military presence while defending American global military deployment. Leavitt was visibly struggling now, her face flushed with a combination of anger and embarrassment. President Traore, American military presence around the world serves to maintain international stability and protect democratic values. We're invited by legitimate governments and we operate within international law. Are you? Traore asked, his eyebrows rising slightly. Because the American military presence in Syria was never authorized by the Syrian government or the UN Security Council. The drone strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia operate without the consent of those governments. The military base in Guantanamo Bay exists despite Cuban opposition. The factual precision of his examples was making it impossible for Leavitt to maintain her narrative about American respect for sovereignty and international law. But let's talk about democratic values, Traore continued, his tone becoming more pointed. A mess. Leavitt, you represent an administration that has imposed economic sanctions on Cuba for over 60 years, despite the fact that virtually every country in the world opposes those sanctions. Is overriding global democratic opinion to maintain failed policies an example of respecting democratic values? The Cuba example was particularly damaging because it highlighted how American policy often contradicted international democratic consensus. You've imposed sanctions on Iran, Venezuela, and numerous other countries, causing humanitarian crises that primarily harm ordinary citizens rather than government officials. Is collective punishment of civilian populations an example of protecting human rights? Leavitt tried to interrupt, but Traore continued speaking with the same measured calm that had characterized his entire response. You've supported the Saudi Arabian government despite its involvement in the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, its assassination of journalists, and its systematic oppression of women and minorities. Is supporting authoritarian regimes an example of promoting democratic governance? Each example was a direct challenge to American moral authority, presented with facts that Leavitt couldn't dispute without undermining her own government's policies. President Traore, you're engaging in anti-American propaganda, Leavitt snapped, her diplomatic composure finally cracking completely. Anti-American propaganda? Traore repeated, his tone sharpening for the first time. Ms. Leavitt, I'm citing American policies and asking you to explain how they align with the principles you claim I should follow. If those policies sound like anti-American propaganda when described accurately, perhaps the problem isn't my description. The response was devastating because it highlighted that Leavitt was essentially admitting that honest descriptions of American foreign policy sounded like propaganda against America. Let me ask you something more direct, Traore continued, moving closer to the podium where Leavitt stood. You said I should learn from established democracies about governance. But which established democracy should I learn from? Should I learn from the United States, where corporations can spend unlimited amounts on political campaigns, where gerrymandering allows politicians to choose their voters, and where the candidate who receives fewer votes can become president? The systematic critique of American democracy was clearly painful for Leavitt, who had built her career on promoting American superiority in global affairs. Should I learn from France, which controls the currency of 14 African nations and requires them to deposit their foreign reserves in French banks? Should I learn from the United Kingdom, which continues to benefit from wealth extracted from former colonies while those same countries struggle with poverty? Or perhaps I should learn from Germany, which lectures African countries about human rights while selling weapons to authoritarian regimes and supporting economic policies that create refugee crises? Each example was a precision strike against the moral authority of Western democracies, delivered with facts that exposed the gap between their rhetoric and reality. A mess. Leavitt, here's what I think you fundamentally misunderstand about my governance, Traore said, his voice gaining passion for the first time. I'm not rejecting democratic values. I'm rejecting the hypocrisy of being lectured about democratic values by representatives of countries that consistently violate those values when they conflict with national interests. The distinction was crucial because it positioned Traore not as anti-democratic but as pro-authentic democracy. In 2 years, my government has provided free healthcare to every citizen, eliminated university tuition, nationalized our gold mines to fund domestic development rather than foreign profits, and reduced terrorist incidents through community-based security rather than foreign military intervention. The concrete achievements were undeniable, creating a stark contrast with the lecture-based approach that Leavitt had tried to take. Meanwhile, American citizens cannot afford healthcare, American students graduate with crushing debt, American corporations extract wealth from developing countries while American communities struggle with poverty, and American military interventions consistently create more instability than they resolve. So I ask you directly, Ms. Leavitt, what exactly should I learn from American governance that would benefit the people of Burkina Faso? The challenge was direct and specific, forcing Leavitt to either defend American domestic failures or admit that American governance wasn't the model she had claimed it was. Leavitt stood in stunned silence for several seconds, clearly unable to formulate a response that wouldn't further undermine her position. President Traore, she finally said, her voice barely concealing her frustration, I think this conversation has moved far from its original purpose. We invited you here to discuss cooperation, not to engage in attacks on American policies. Did you? Traore asked, his tone becoming almost conversational. Because your opening statement was an attack on my policies, my legitimacy, and my qualifications for leadership. You lectured me about democratic governance, international cooperation, and learning from established democracies. I responded to your criticisms with specific examples and direct questions. If you consider that an attack, perhaps the problem isn't my response but your inability to defend the policies you're promoting. The role reversal was complete. Leavitt, who had intended to put Traore on the defensive, was now being lectured about diplomatic courtesy and intellectual honesty. Ms. Leavitt, let me conclude with something I hope you'll consider, Traore said, his tone becoming more conciliatory. The era of African leaders accepting lectures from Western officials about governance is over. We're not rejecting cooperation, but we are rejecting subordination. If the Trump administration wants to work with African countries, we're open to partnerships based on mutual respect and mutual benefit. But we will no longer accept arrangements where we provide resources and deference while you provide criticism and condescension. The choice is yours. Engage with us as equals, or watch as Africa builds relationships with partners who respect our sovereignty and contribute to our development. As Traore handed back the microphone and returned to his seat, the briefing room erupted in sustained applause from the press corps, an almost unprecedented show of approval for a foreign leader in the White House. Leavitt stood at the podium, visibly shaken, her attempt to score political points against an African leader having backfired so spectacularly that she had inadvertently provided him with a platform to deliver one of the most effective critiques of American foreign policy ever heard in the White House briefing room. The rising star of Trump's administration had just learned that schooling someone requires actually knowing more than they do. As the applause continued, several journalists were already typing furiously on their phones, understanding that they had just witnessed a diplomatic masterclass that would dominate news cycles for days. The footage of America's youngest press secretary being systematically dismantled by an African president would be replayed across every major network and shared millions of times on social media. Are there any other questions? Leavitt asked weakly, clearly desperate to end a briefing that had become a public relations disaster for the administration. But the damage was already done. In the space of 30 minutes, Traore had accomplished something that seasoned diplomats and experienced politicians had failed to do. He had exposed the fundamental contradictions in American foreign policy rhetoric while simultaneously presenting a clear alternative vision based on sovereignty, self-determination, and concrete results. More importantly, he had done it with such calm professionalism that he had made Leavitt's aggressive approach seem juvenile and unprepared by comparison. The 26-year-old who had earned her reputation through combative press conferences had been outclassed by someone who combined intellectual sophistication with diplomatic grace. As the briefing concluded and journalists filed out of the room, many were already crafting headlines that would dominate the news cycle. African President School's White House press secretary, Traore's masterclass leaves Trump admin speechless, and When Rising Stars Fall. Leavitt's failed attempt to embarrass African leader. The international reaction was immediate and overwhelming. African news outlets hailed Traore's performance as a watershed moment in North-South relations, with headlines like, "The Day Africa Talked Back," and "When Dignity Met Arrogance." European media focused on the broader implications for Western relations with Africa, while American progressive outlets used the confrontation to highlight the contradictions in Trump administration foreign policy. But perhaps the most significant impact was on young people across Africa and the African diaspora, who saw in Traore's performance